Okay, so today would be the second class on reinforcement learning, and basically we'll start where we left off, which was with respect to active learning, model-based active learning, and the need for exploration. That's where we started. That's where we stopped. We're going to continue from there. Then talk about a couple of model-free methods, temporal difference learning and Q-learning, and think of a bunch of important dimensions that are relevant in thinking about reinforcement learning techniques. And that's more or less what I'm hoping to do today. So before I get started, are there any questions? Okay. So this is, by the way, the current snapshot of the piazza, where you notice the way the questions are asked and the time when the answers are submitted. There's barely any light that can pass through in most places. So clearly TAs are not having a life. And then, these are some of the people from the student side who actually are providing useful contributions. These are the number of contributions, but I think some of them certainly are also providing useful contributions. So you want to impress me, you be in this list. Okay, that's how you get your A+. Then, of course, I get an A+ because I have 157 contributions. Niharika will also get it, but I think she already has one, so it doesn't matter. So that's basically the current statistics on that. So, I keep repeating this in this class, that one of the most important things I hope you guys will learn from this class is not to say that I'm using a depth POMDP solution with deep learning when what you are doing is a single agent, fully observable scenario where what you can get by with A* search. Okay, there is no advantage in kind of taking a tractable problem and putting it into an intractable envelope. Okay, actually there is advantages, you get jobs. But even if you get the jobs doing that, please understand the intellectual subterfuge involved in trying to make something simple look unnecessarily complex. Okay, by all means, cheat your bosses and get your bonuses, but don't cheat yourself, don't delude yourself. It looks as if I'm sort of keep saying this, and it's really, who is doing this kind of nonsense? Why am I so worried about it? I gave you some examples. It looked, I might be coming across as a bit party pooper. Why can't we just get on with the deep learning, deep reinforcement learning already? This is a paper in Nature that actually came just a couple of days back. And this is a paper written by these two guys, basically saying that a different paper written by De Vries, etc., which also got published in Nature, got a lot of publicity because they were using deep learning for predicting aftershocks. What's there not to be impressed? Especially if you're in California, you want to predict aftershocks for earthquakes. And if you're using deep learning, that must be good stuff, right? And Nature obviously published this. And then these other people essentially wrote a paper, these are the party poopers, saying that essentially, first of all, they clarify that the same authors who wrote that other paper wrote a different paper in 2017 where they showed that actually this problem can be solved with no AI, like whatsoever. But then you solve a problem without AI, who is impressed? Right? Right? Okay, so they kind of, that 2017 paper clearly did not go into Nature because Nature, and they wound up publishing it in some geological letters or something. Nobody really, that's important, reads that stuff, right? And then instead, of course, they did this whole thing with deep learning, with only 30,451 weights. It's not even the really deep learning. They took like a moderately deep learning. They got their AWS account. They got start Keras and let's go. And then these party poopers essentially pointed out that they could have done it with logistic regression, which is using 2 parameters. Instead of 13,451 parameters. Right? Furthermore, they actually say that logistic regression is actually performs better than DNN. These are the kinds of people who won't get papers into Nature, whereas those other bozos already got a paper into Nature. Okay, so kind of keep this in mind that obviously there's a hype, and the hype is not just in industries, it's also in academia. Nature is considered like the best journal to publish, and in fact, most of the time recently, Nature will publish your stuff if you throw in some AI buzzwords. And remember, I already told you about that thing about the melanoma results. Okay, at least there, in fact, it was just basically pointing out that the systems, the widely sold systems, are confused by markers. Here, the delusion is self-delusion because the researchers deluded themselves, and of course, Nature deluded itself. Okay, so just an example that this is happening like right now, which is why I want you to kind of keep track of the problem you're solving, rather than just say, can I start Keras right now? Okay. In fact, how many of you know Rube Goldberg? Raise your hand if you heard of Rube Goldberg. Okay. Yeah, the rest of if you're in engineering college, you should know Rube Goldberg. Okay, Rube Goldberg was this turn of the century cartoonist actually who would make these amazingly complex contraptions for solving extremely simple tasks. So, for example, this simple contraption, which would be publishable in Nature of its time, I guess, is a contraption that would tell Professor Butts to remind him that he's supposed to mail the letter he wrote for his wife, to his wife. Okay, notice how simple it is. As you walk past the cobbler shop, hook A strikes the suspended boot B, causing it to kick football C through the goalpost D. Football drops into basket E, and then strikes and F tilts sprinkling can, causing water to soak coat tails, and the coat strings. And opens the door J of cage, allowing the bird K to walk out on the perch L and get the worm M, which is then attached to the string N. This pulls down the window shade O, on which is written, "You shall mail that letter." Okay? There is a lot of Rube Goldberg AI being done in industry. I hope you get some of that money. You're taking my class, so you should get those salaries too. But be aware of whether or not you're solving the problem with the right kind of technique. This is the Rube Goldberg, and this is, of course, sledgehammer to break eggs. And this is the Rube Goldberg sledgehammer AI, and you want to be aware of that. Okay? That's the kind of thing that we should keep in track of. Okay, recap from last class. Last class, we essentially were doing this model-based, what we call adaptive dynamic programming. And then we did it for passive. So basically, ADP estimates the transition function TSAS dash. So Monte Carlo directly estimated the value function. Okay. Here you are estimating the transition function TSAS dash from the traces and uses this transition function to evaluate the policy. And to evaluate the policy, it of course uses the Bellman equation for the policy evaluation, which just says that with respect to policy pi, the value of the state S is the reward of state S plus discount factor times the expected value of doing the action A, which is equal to pi S. That means whatever is the action that that policy said you should be doing in that state. You did that in the state S, you got to state S dash. The probability of that happening is this number times the value of the state S dash with respect to this policy pi. Right? And you have this, and basically when you do this, if you have 10 states, S1 to S10, then you will wind up getting 10 equations. You'll wind up getting 10 simultaneous linear equations. And you solve them, you will get the values for each of the states with respect to this policy pi. And when you do this, in essence, the problem that Monte Carlo search had, which was not taking into account the correlation between states, the value correlation between states, etc., is all taken care of right now. Right? Okay? So that much we did that, we understood that, but then we also pointed out that if you are anyway getting transition function t, ostensibly to use these equation, you could very well have used instead this equation, which is using the same transition rather than just do what the current policy is asking you to do in that state. Consider doing every possible action, and because you have the transition function, you can compute for every action A this expression, right, which is the expected return of doing that action A. And you take the max over all the actions and then add that to RS, you will then get a better value. It basically, in some sense, it's like V star, except we'll call it VG, V greedy. This is the greedy value corresponding to the transition function you have. And this is where I told you that essentially, given this transition function, you are actually able to do this policy, which is at least as good as V pi. Okay? And you got it free. Might as well use it. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, if you are doing this, then in essence, it's essentially not only are you, once you got this VG, right, you can then convert the VG into pi, which is the policy, the pi g. You can convert VG into pi g. Right? Once I give you a value function, you can convert it to the policy function, which is basically for each state, what is the action that is actually giving it the maximum expected value back. Okay, now the pi g is going to be your policy. You're going to act with this. So we put you into this room saying only use pi. But then now you figured out a better policy, pi g. This is active. Now you can actually do this stuff. You see what I'm saying? Now the question, of course, is pi g the same as pi star? Or is Vg the same as V star? It is true that Vg is better than V pi and pi g is better than pi because of the way this is done. In fact, if this is the best policy for that transition function, you will pick that. Right? Okay, the question is it pi star? Is it V star? And the answer is no, unfortunately. So there is V pi, which is less than or equal to Vg, which is still less than or equal to V star. So the question, of course, is why is that disturbance coming? It's because when you got the transition function, you got the transition function using pi. So you only went around using the policy pi. It is possible that this policy sort of intentionally stopped you from going into some other areas, because of which you don't know the values there. Okay, and in fact, V star might be quite different because you haven't seen some of the state space at all. Okay, and to be able to do that, to actually handle that problem, you have to explore, you have to go off policy. Whatever policy you've been given, you have to go off policy during execution and do things that, once in a while do actions that the policy is not telling you to do. Okay, and that part is called exploration problem. Okay, and I showed you this last time. In fact, if you have a world like this, and just imagine that you are started in one of these states where you know the policy. okay, then I can guarantee you that you'll never go to either of these states. You'll do lots and lots of things, but you'll never go to these states. In this small problem, you know why, because again, these are actions where they will go in the intended direction with high probability, and the two perpendicular directions with the low probability, but never into the backward direction. Because they never go into the backward direction, these two are essentially never going to be seen. So all I need to know is you are going to be blind of these states. So I'll go ahead, I, the nature, will go ahead and put, oh, this is like plus 1,000 reward here and plus 3,000 reward here. Then whatever the heck of policy you got in this place will be much smaller than what you could have done if you went there. You see what I'm saying? So this is basically the need for exploration. And this is sort of a fundamental trade-off. To some extent, you have gotten some amount of experience. So in fact, I made it sound as if there was one policy that just gave you the translation function, and then you have to decide to just use the translation function. But really what might happen is you have lived for some amount of time using some policy, okay, let's say, and then after you computed the translation function, you can then get the greedy policy, right? Because I computed this translation function using the original policy that I was asked to follow. But then I turned around and actually computed a greedy policy with respect to this translation function. That would be different in general from the policy I started from pi. Now my question is, do I just keep using this greedy policy or also go off policy from the greedy policy? So at any given point of time in your life, you have this fundamental trade-off. Do I exploit what I have learned until now, or do I learn some more and then start exploiting? This is the exploration-exploitation trade-off. This is the point I was making when the end of the class, last class, that grad students obviously have a different exploration-exploitation trade-off. They tended to give higher value for exploration compared to MS students who would start right after MS and start exploiting, and compared to college students who might be doing even before that, and so on. Okay? In general, you want to prove that you have the optimal policy, then you really need to consider exploring all parts of the state space. So how would you get that? How would you get that? Essentially, there are several schemes. The obvious ones, essentially, go off policy, which is what, kind of not direct analogy, but I think of my cow philosophy as that. You have some goal, you're just going on the life's highway, but once in a while take detours, stop to smell the roses. Okay, so explore, don't always just follow the policy. I know some of you wish I actually followed a policy for the class, that whatever it is that I told you I will teach in the class, I just teach that and go away. And I keep making lots and lots of detours because I believe essentially that you have to explore. You can't get optimal value unless you also do detours. Maybe there's something called too much detours, and maybe some of you are feeling that, but it's important that you not follow the policy completely. So here's the simplest way of doing it. At any given point of time, understand you have a greedy policy pi g. Right? That's what I just showed you. At any given point of time, you have a greedy policy pi g that you are following. With probability epsilon, you ignore the policy, you throw the plan out and just leave a little, which is just do a randomly pick an action for that state. Probability 1 minus epsilon, you follow your policy. You follow your current policy. Do you see what I'm saying? So I was actually telling this to somebody at the end of the last class, that if you are distinguishing between people who dropped out after the high school and started doing jobs versus went up to like a master's or a PhD and started looking for jobs, there is actually a spectrum. There could be people who are dropped out after high school but are taking evening classes. That's a little exploration. You see what I'm saying? You spend huge amount of time during the day, maybe doing some random job, but then in the evening you're doing classes, or whatever classes you want to take. I think AI should be the class, but any class you want to take, and you would essentially be increasing your exploration. You see what I'm saying? So that epsilon is the probability with which they're doing something off their policy. If you have like a 9-to-5 job, your policy is just stick to that job. And you see how much happy I am in saying stick with the job. In general, that's like a mind-numbing, boring thing that you have to do from 9 to 5. And instead of doing that, once in a while you're doing something strange. And doing that oftentimes is basically the way of coming out of going off policy. Okay? If you control epsilon, then essentially you have, if epsilon is high, that means you're mostly exploring. You're not sticking to anything. So if the parents of PhD students tend to think that why can't you have a smaller epsilon? Why can't you settle down already and get some job or something? Okay? Whereas epsilon is too low, then you just say whatever is the policy I have currently, I'm not going to change. That's all, I'm just going to follow forever. Notice that when you're following your policy, there can be stochastic outcomes, right? So in fact, it's very important to understand that when you are following this policy, there are stochastic outcomes. When you try to go here, you might come here. When you try to go from here to here, you might come here or stay here, right? Or when you try to go up, you might go up or go this side or go this side. There is stochasticity. Even with the stochasticity, there are parts of the search space that you might be blind to. That's possible. All I needed to do is give you one counterexample that if you just follow a single policy just because of the stochasticity of the policy doesn't mean that you will get the rest of the state space. You'll get more state space than you expected because there is stochasticity, but it still doesn't count. It doesn't look at the entire space. Whereas this idea will. Right? Because with epsilon probability, at any state, you are doing a randomly chosen action. Right? So eventually, you will see the entire space. Anytime you are exploring, you are losing the money that you could have made during that time. When you take evening classes, instead of doing evening classes, you could have made money standing in Walmart selling stuff, being a Walmart cashier instead of being a McDonald's burger flipper. Right? You could have got a little more money. You lost that money by actually taking evening classes. Furthermore, you actually had to pay tuition, so you got lots and lots of money lost. Okay? But the point is that exploration has cost. You are leaving money, so-called money, on the table. But to some extent, without exploration, you might be leaving so much money on the table without even knowing. Do you see what I'm saying? What you are not exploiting, you can feel, oh my God, I could have been making almost $3 an hour for this 1.5 hour class. But what if, in fact, after this class, after that evening class, later on, you get to a point where you make a lot more money, assuming money is valuable. Okay? So that's basically the simplest idea. Now, of course, as I said, problems with random actions, you do explore the space, but keep thrashing once the learning is done. What if, in fact, you're done learning? So, in fact, if you're doing this in this context, and eventually you started seeing these states, right? Then there is no point in exploring any further. So you can stop exploring once you have seen the entire state space. But the problem, unfortunately, in real life is you don't know how big the state space is. Okay? So the best you can do is essentially reduce your exploration probability as your life goes on. In the beginning, it's like extremely silly to say, I'm done with grade 1, like Calvin and Hobbes, I'm done with grade 1, I'm ready to go to the job now. That's like an exploitation policy. That's much more laughable. Okay, there he should have had epsilon closer to 0.7 maybe. By MS, maybe epsilon should be 0.5. Whatever you guys want. Maybe many of you think it should be 0.001 ms. Okay, so, but in general, as you go forward, you might say, I think there's a good chance I've seen more of the space, so I will reduce the exploration. Okay, which is a very reasonable thing to do, and that increases, that basically ensures the not only will you be converging through the, so as soon as you do the exploration, you are guaranteed to converge to the optimal policy in the limit. In the limit means if you wind up visiting every state infinitely often, then at that point you take the T that you currently have and you take the greedy policy with respect to that. That will also be the optimal policy. Which is why actually we have this GLIE. Greedy in the limit of infinite exploration. If you take a greedy policy after the limit of infinite exploration, that is going to be optimal policy. And what we are doing here is, can we avoid spending that much time and still come somewhat closer to optimal policy? The theorems are hard to come by here as to how close you are to the optimal policy. But clearly, it makes sense to do this. As you go, you live longer and longer, you reduce the amount of exploration. In some weird sense, this is sort of true. If you start exploring when you are my age, they are not necessarily as positive in describing it. They call it midlife crisis, which somehow doesn't have any positive connotations. But I do want to do glee thing, but apparently I can't because I've lived long enough and I should settle down. Okay? Whereas if you don't explore when you are in first grade, then you are bozos. Right? Because you are essentially assuming that I have done enough, no more learning for me, I'm closing my brain. Okay? So the other, actually, a more interesting idea is exploration functions, which is the next idea that we'll look at, where in here, essentially, it's one size fits all. So the epsilon is not dependent on the state. Epsilon is not dependent on the state. Okay, but as you live, there are certain states that you have already visited close to infinite number of times. And some other states that you just happen to visit newly. So an idea would be to differentially make novel states, the states that are less visited, look more appealing than they are supposed to be just by their current value. Do you see what I'm saying? So you want to give novelty points. A state that you haven't seen before, whatever its current valuation, a state that you haven't seen enough before, whatever your greedy value function says its value is, you add a little extra to it so that it becomes more appealing. You guys get this? Okay? And in general, actually, this is the same, basically the philosophy of I'll try everything once. If I haven't done something yet, let me just try it. Right? And in some sense, actually, evolution baked in this sort of novelty seeking into us, especially into our young. That's why people say, I'm sure I'll do some base jumping. Once, I'll try once. And I'll be looking in the back and saying, oh my God, you're going to die. But, people try it anyway. Okay? So, in general, the things that you haven't tried, you try because you give it higher novelty points. There is no separate value for novelty, you're just doing a pseudo thing. You're increasing, you're giving like extra points to a state because it hasn't been seen before. But then after it has been seen enough number of times, this bonus should go away. This is like the newcomer's bonus. You see what I'm saying? So what I'll do is I will use a function like this. So this function f of basically of the value and the number of times you have gone to that state before. And f of un would be u plus k by n. Okay? And the idea being that if you haven't gone to that before, then you are getting a bigger plus. Okay? So take the value estimate into account and returns an optimistic utility. It's making the value be more optimistic than it should be because you haven't yet seen it enough number of times. Okay? And so then basically your value iteration would now be done with the f function thrown in the middle. So you are keeping track of the visit counts to the state. If you have visited long enough, then its value is the value that it actually got. Otherwise, it gets a bonus. Okay? And the bonus wears off as you have seen this state enough number of times because the count increases. Do you see what I'm saying? Because if n is infinity, then it will be k by infinity, that will be 0. The bonus will be 0. Otherwise, it's as many as k extra points. Got that? Simple idea. This is an exploration function. This is better than the previous idea because it separates states into the ones that I've seen more often versus the states that I've seen less often. And allows me to focus my exploration on the states that I haven't seen enough. So the states that I've seen before, if I wind up going there, I just do what my policy tells me to do. States that I haven't seen enough number of times, that's where I wind up, in essence, basically giving them a bonus, a look better. So in effect, I'm going to be doing off policy with respect to the greedy policy. Okay, so that's the exploration function idea. So that's basically model-based learning. We talked about passive model-based, active model-based, and the distinction is very small. In fact, this is just the summary of whatever we discussed till now. So you do get a, instead of just getting V pi, you can take Vg, which is the greedy value, which is still not V star, but then if you do one of these explorations, then it will eventually become V star. Okay? Now we go back to model-free learning. Remember I said model-based and model-free. Okay, so if you remember what we started with was, we started with Monte Carlo, and then we knew what its problems were, and then we went into model-based, where you compute T, and you tried both passive and active. Now you want to try model-free. Model-free, as I said, what did I say about